first shared their stories in caves, connected art, nature, and science, led us toward new horizons. Who thought to capture motion, spark an engine to life, turn television into a playground? Every day, you create the playful, the functional, and the unexpected. You break down walls and take us to astonishing places. Tell stories, leap borders, and create beauty for tomorrow. Because at Unity, we believe the world is a better place with more creators in it, where everyone has a chance to shape the world.
A very good afternoon to all of our audience across South APAC. Well, who is South APAC? It's Greater India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific. And you can tell by the number of languages there, it's a pretty diverse group. Today's webinar will be in English though, however. Thank you all for joining us on this Friday. Just a few pointers for today's webinar. All questions are in the Q&A box if you are joining us by Zoom. If you're joining us on YouTube or another social media channel, you can put your questions in there and we will relay them into the main Zoom room. We do not use the raise hand function for this webinar, so please don't use it. And today's session will be approximately 75 minutes, including the Q&A at the end. Unity Technologies, real-time 3D set is being used in a variety of industries across the globe, including architecture, engineering, construction, automotive, transport, manufacturing, education, film and animation, in research, simulation, robotics, etc. So being skilled up in Unity gives you great career path in all of these industries, including games as well. Why not take a look at our Unity certifications? There's various levels of certifications, and you can take a look at this website here. We'll pop the link for that in the chat window for you as well to get started on your journey. Just a reminder, the new long-term support version, LTS version of Unity is out now. Please update it, stay abreast of all of the changes and latest features. One of today's attendees who have registered will go into the draw for a Unity swag pack when you complete the survey at the end of the webinar. If you are joining us from one of these social media platforms on the screen now, please scan the QR code to register if you would like to qualify to win one of these swag packs. And don't worry if you missed the QR code now, it's going to be on the next screen, but will be like your last chance to scan it. There it is. We've had a number of winners lately. We'll also be doing one for the best question at the end of the webinar today. So have a really solid question and one of our team will pick that question as a winner as well. So there's 2 swag packs being given away today. And you can see some of our lucky winners, recent winners there on the right-hand side of the screen. Today's the last topic of the month, Introduction to the UI Toolkit, and that content will be delivered by Teck. Hey Teck, how you doing? Joining us from Singapore.
Hey Andy, going pretty well. It's pretty hot here though.
Awesome, and we're also joined by Sarah and Jenny on my team and a number of the field engineering team across APAC from Malaysia, Australia, and Singapore also. And without any further ado, Teck, I'm going to hand it over to you. And just to mention, folks, live recording, we pre-recorded this content last night because we're featuring the editor, and to optimize for quality for your viewing, we have pre-recorded this last night, and all of the field engineering team are here to answer your questions. Without any further ado, take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon. Hope everyone's having a great day. I am Teck, and today I'm going to be taking you through an intro to UI Toolkit. So, what's being covered today? We're going to have a quick look at some comparisons between UI Toolkit and uGUI, which is our sort of incumbent UI system. Some basics of UI Toolkit. We'll cover UI Builder and some of the fundamentals around some of the layout ideas. we're going to kind of walk through building a sample UI, just sort of a main menu kind of thing, via UI Builder, and some C# to deal with data binding and handling of events. So first up, UI Toolkit itself is kind of based on and inspired by standard web technologies. If you've done any sort of web dev pages, like web pages or web apps, some of your knowledge is actually going to be transferable. A lot of the core concepts are going to be familiar. You know, the whole concept of separation of your content, layout, styling. There's a more detailed sort of comparison look at UI Toolkit versus uGUI, as well as IMGUI, which is really more on the editor side of things. And this will kind of go over a little bit of what situations you might use UI Toolkit versus uGUI. We'll include those links in the follow-up emails after this webinar. So a little bit of the two technologies. UI Toolkit, as mentioned, basically web technology based. Under the hood, it's Yoga Layout and Flexbox. The sort of key thing is there's a clear separation of content, which is our UXML files, styling, which is our USS files, subset of CSS, and behavior, which is handled by C#. Now, having style sheets is sort of makes it a lot easier to modify your entire themes out of the box. So you can take the same UXML document, render it with a different style sheet. You know, you can pass it a completely different style sheet for theming, for whatever your needs are. So the downsides, there's no world space interaction right now out of the box. I've seen some third-party repos on GitHub. Not tested them myself, but the main thing is that we don't out of the box do any transformations of screen space touches or clicks or raycasts to world space or to UI space. The other thing is that there's no lighting or VFX at the moment, or custom shaders. Those are on the roadmap. For uGUI, which is the incumbent, been around since 4.6. It's game object based. It means it's fairly familiar in terms of tooling, and you have the prefab workflow to kind of keep your variants, keep your sort of reusability pretty strong. One big plus right now is that it can still be used for interactive world space UI. So you can have, and this is important for things like VR, or having just sort of UI that's in the world that you can interact with. Can be good for immersion. Another big thing is that it's fairly trivial to have interaction with lighting, particles, VFX. You can have custom shaders applied to the GUI, so that's all pretty nice. One thing it can't do is be used for editor GUI stuff. So custom inspectors, custom editor windows, any sort of editor tools that you're building, you cannot use uGUI. So that's the very quick comparison out of the way. We're going to jump into the basics. So first things first is UI Builder. That's our visual tool for authoring UI in UI Toolkit. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the editor to take a look at the interface. So first things first, to get to UI Builder, it's just under Window and UI Toolkit, UI Builder. So that opens up a little window. I generally find I have to maximize this, or make it a lot bigger. Otherwise it's a little cramped. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. The center sort of portion is the bread and butter of this. It's the main viewport for the canvas. Navigation-wise, it's a middle click to drag around, left click to select, mouse wheel to scroll, as well as a drop down for different zoom levels. You can fit canvas to make sure that everything kind of sits in the center if you lose it. Style sheets and hierarchy we'll jump back into in a bit when we start getting some content going. The library is fairly useful. This is kind of where you're going to get all of the main controls. So you have visual elements, just like empty game object sort of. Scroll view, list view, group box. Then you got different controls. Your text fields, your sliders, numeric fields where you can enter numbers. I tend to prefer having this in tree view, so if I drop this down, go to tree view, it's a little more compact. If you happen to be doing editor scripts, UIs for editor scripts, it's going to be important to also enable editor extension authoring. And this will let you take a look at, will let you use a bunch of other controls that are not available. Things like property field, which is really useful, and object fields. We're not going to look at that right now. So do that. Over here, the inspector is where, similar to the game object inspector, look at what properties are available, the information from them, and being able to edit them. The drop down over here lets you pick a theme. The default is active editor theme, so whether you're on light theme, dark theme, but you can switch those to make sure that your UI kind of works for both main themes. And if you're doing runtime, it's usually useful to switch it over to the default runtime theme. Partly because the look and feel of some of the controls is going to be very, very different. Sliders in particular. Now down at the bottom, you have the UXML preview and the USS preview. And we'll take a look a little bit later at what those look like when there's actual content. Over in the inspector, if you select the root, you can see the size of the window, size, height. You can resize that over here, and that will update. What's actually really useful if you're doing game UI or app UI is to click the match game view button, toggle, and this will make sure that your UI actually matches your game view, both in terms of actual size resolution. So if I switch to full HD, you'll see that it's 1920 by 1080, as well as aspect. So if I switch over to 1:1, you'll see that my UI is also set to 1:1. So I'm just switch back to 16:9, and we're going to go ahead and start making some content. So I said earlier we're going to make a fairly simple sort of like main menu kind of thing. So sort of very briefly, we'll kind of figure a logo, some sort of a logo up here, and going to say take up about 60 to 70% of the width of the main container, maybe a third of the height, and then we'll have another container here that will contain, our menu items, maybe some labels, some options, and this will take up maybe 50% of the screen width. So with that out of the way, first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and save, and this will give me, I'm going to save this as menu demo.uxml. And this just makes sure that, while we're working, we can make sure to save, don't lose any work. So this gives you your sort of full, document. What I usually like to do is I like to have a sort of a root element here, so that I can make sure that I've got my root document size correct. So this root element I'm going to make sure is basically full size. Right. So I'm going to ensure that this is 100%, 100% for the width and height down here at the size. What's kind of useful, or what's kind of handy here, is that you can change the units over here with the, so you see the drop down over here. You can change the units without actually needing the drop down. If I type in 100 px, then I get 100 pixels. If I type in 100%, I get 100%. So small time savers. So that's my main document. I'm just gonna, just for organization's sake, I'm gonna call that root. I am going to put another visual element here, and I'm going to call this logo. I'm double clicking on this to rename it. You can also go to the inspector and type the name at the top over here under name. And so I mentioned I wanted this logo to be maybe about, say, 70% wide and maybe 35% high. Now you'll see over here it's not quite centered. It's sitting somewhere in the all the way on the left, top left. So what I can do is I can go back up to my root, my parent element, and this will jump us into Flex, which is our first next slide. So Flex is sort of a keyword that kind of deals with a lot of the layout stuff in UI Toolkit. Now, each visual element can basically have a particular flex direction, either downwards as a row, as rows, upwards as rows reverse, left to right as columns, or right to left as columns reverse. This direction sort of influences a lot of these properties here and how they work. So things like how they shrink, how they grow, how they align, how they justify. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the root, and I'm going to set this to align center. And these actually change their orientations based on whether you're in row mode or column mode. And you can see that these diagrams actually change. So it's a little bit, it helps a lot because the nomenclature can be a little bit confusing. Is it align? Is it justify? The main thing is align basically sort of lines up your content across the major axis. So if we're going down, align will sort of align your content left, right, and center. Justify will go, along the axis. So if you're going in rows, it's going to align justify either top, bottom, or middle. So the little icons help a lot. So if we jump over to here, slides. So as I mentioned, generally flex, all the flex properties are relative to the direction. So flex, grow, and shrink kind of provide a way to ensure that your content will grow or shrink based on sort of a weighted sum, and we'll take a look at that in a second. And your flex basis is sort of the pre-calculation size. So alignment, again, as mentioned, is all relative to the flex direction. So the flex direction is pretty important to all of this. So jumping back here, we're going to go ahead and in a logo. So currently UI Builder does not yet have a way to add an image class. You can do this in C# or directly in the UXML, but we haven't added it to UI Builder just yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to make use of the fact that this visual element currently has a size in the layout, and we're going to give it a background image. So background images can take a texture, render texture, sprite, or a vector graphic. And I'm going to use this Unity logo that I've got here. So the first thing you'll see is that it's stretched, and that's because the default scale mode for background images is to just scale to, just stretch to fit the background. The two other modes are basically sort of fill, stretch to fill, and stretch to fit, or scale to fit. And so I'm going to go with this one so that we can see the whole logo. But sometimes this can be, more appropriate. So we've got that. It's probably going to be a little bit hard to see against, if there's a bright background. So I'm going to go to the root, and I'm going to give it a background. Now, this is a good time to take a look at the fact that even though this property right here, it says it's black, it says it's full alpha, but that's clearly not the case here visually, and that's because the sort of like default style sheet sets this to a sort of a transparent, fairly transparent black. So if I were to set this now, you'll see that it immediately kind of overrides. So I'm going to give it a black and maybe like say 60%. So 60% black. That gives me something, a little bit more contrasty. So I have a logo. I also need to have some content, some items. So I'm going to call this, again, double click on that. Let's call this items. And I'm going to give it size of, say, 50%. And I'm going to set the flex to grow. So again, the grow is in the direction of the container, which is set to row. So it's going to grow vertically. And these are essentially these auto things are essentially letting the layout engine know that this should be based on the size of the content. Grow lets it sort of grow to the size of the container. And we'll take a look at how that can be sort of massaged. So if we take a button here, and let's maybe put a couple of buttons in there. Let's put 3 buttons in here. Now if I take this button and I set it up to grow, you can see that it essentially fills up as much space as it can. These two are not set to grow, so they're just sort of fixed size. Now if I decide to set the bottom one to grow, set it also to 1, then it takes up the same space as the first button. And if I set this guy to grow 1, now all 3 of these take up the same amount of space. So these values, it's not just 0 or 1, you can set it to 0.5, 2. These values essentially act as a weighted sum. So right now they're all equal. But if I set the middle one to say 2, it's now taking up twice as much space as, or basically the button is twice as big as the other 2. And change this to say 5, and accordingly it will grow larger relative to everything else. So I'm going to unset this. I'm actually going to delete these 2 buttons for now, and I'm going to unset grow. I will take a look at that, at what happened there in a minute. So we're going to style this button because right now this button's a bit dull. So we basically just kind of go through these properties and kind of see what we want to do with them. Now, first things first, I want to get rid of this margin. I'm just going to get rid of the margins. And I'm going to keep the padding because I want to make sure that my text doesn't go all the way to the edge. I'm going to ensure that this button takes up 100% of the width of this container. Likewise, I'm going to make sure that the height is, say, about 50 pixels. So it's got a nice height to it. The text looks a little small right now. So I'm going to bump up the size by going down to the text area and change the size. Maybe I'll make it bold. The font itself is a little bit dull. So over here in your font assets, you'll notice that there's two font properties here. One takes actual true type font files. These are TTF files, variable fonts if possible. And the font asset takes essentially the same SEF font assets that get generated when when you're working with TextMesh Pro. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Grab this font here, and so that looks a little bit more interesting. Go to 30, and okay, so I've got a button here, and perhaps I don't really want just a standard, just a standard square button. So maybe I'll do something with the border. Perhaps let's give it a 4-pixel border with an 8-pixel radius, and the radius sort of gives it a bit of curvature. So let's go with an 8-pixel radius here. So yeah, that works. Maybe I'll make the button a little bit brighter. And okay, so we've got a button. I think I might actually swap this out for a 9-slice button. And for those unfamiliar, 9-slice is essentially a texture that we slice up. So the source of this is a 64-pixel by 64-pixel texture, with the slices happening at 16 pixels from the edges. So over here, I've got no slicing going on. This property over here, got 0 slicing going on. Now, if I change this to 16, and I know that's correct because we now have this thing at the corner, right? So similarly, if I were to get rid of my border, and I swap this out for a border button, and I get rid of my background color, I now have a nice rounded button. Maybe I'll swap that out for one with padding. We've got a nice rounded button now. Out. A bit more height. So we've got a button here. Maybe I want to have a label as well to kind of top things off. And this is black, so let's say I'm going to give the text a color of, say, white, and I'm going to pick the same font so there's some consistency. I'm also going to align the text to the center, and I'm going to change the font size up so it matches the button, and set to bold. So I've got a label here. I can change the text up here, up in the topmost property section. So I'm just going to change that to choose an option, and so that's pretty okay. One thing I'm noticing now is that my logo doesn't really have a lot of room to breathe. So as with earlier when we kind of messed with margin and padding, going to go to the root, and I'm going to change the padding and give myself a bit of breathing room. So let's call it 16 pixels. Now, similarly with width, height, the other measurement properties, margins and paddings can all be set either per pixel or by percentage. So I could give it, say, a 2% padding, or I could give it, say, a 16 pixel padding. So for now, I'll stick to the pixel size padding. So that gives a little bit of breathing room to the logo. Now, a little bit on padding. So margins, borders, padding. Margins are essentially what happens outside of the container, the content container. Padding will affect the size of your content inside the container by pushing it inwards. So now we have a container. We have a button, and we're going to take a look at the UXML file because it's going to be a bit of an eye opener. So let me go ahead and save this, and you can take a look at how long this UXML file is at the bottom. That is incredibly long, and a large part of that, the main part of that, is just from the amount of inline styling that's happening. So if we look at my button here, we have a bunch of stuff that has been overridden from the defaults. You've got a size, margins, font style, size, font size, background colors. All these have been overridden. Every one of those properties is now part of this inline style. So it gets pretty messy. The other thing is that if I were to duplicate this and start doing some more work, and later on I decide that perhaps I don't really like the color of this button, perhaps I want to make it a bit darker, I now have to go back to each of these buttons and change that. Don't really want to do that. So I'm going to delete that button copy. I'm going to make this a little actually darker. And we're going to look at the USS sheets, the style sheets. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go up here to the top corner at the style sheets, and we're going to create a new USS from that plus drop down. And this is, I'm just going to go ahead and call this the same, menu demo USS. And if we click on it, we can see a couple of little hints over here on how we can create classes and selectors. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our button, and we've already got some styling that we like, that we want to reuse. And that's really the main guideline for styles, is that you want to, if you're going to reuse some styling, it's probably useful to have a class. So if we go up to the style class list, what we're going to do is we're going to give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to call it menu button, and we're going to click on extract inline styles to a new class. Now what that's going to do is first it's going to create a class up in the USS file, and then it's going to apply that class to this button, to this element. And so now, if I select, if I hover over the class, you can see that it's highlighted in the UI. So now if I were to duplicate this button, these all have the same class on them. And I can make changes to the class, and these will be reflected everywhere else. So if I were to make this red, it all gets updated. So that's pretty handy. I can change up the font, for example. Let's say the font size. Let's say 36 is nicer. Maybe change up the font itself. So this becomes a lot easier for reusing things. The other major thing is that if we look at the button entry, you can see it's a lot shorter now. All of those inline styles got replaced by this class equals menu button. And all of those stylings basically went into the USS sheet. So this USS sheet has a class and a definition for the class. So all the different properties. We will update the text on the actual buttons. Options. And let's call this quit. Now, up here we have a preview button, which is pretty handy. And what this lets us do is really just test the UI functionality, at least in terms of mouse over behaviors and what this thing looks like. Right now, not a lot going on. The buttons don't really visually do anything. They will receive events like click events, but they won't actually do anything visually. So one of the other nice benefits of having a class that we've assigned to this is that we can also create pseudo classes, and these are, if I select this guy, essentially things like a class, an additional selector for a class. And some of these are sort of built in, so hover, focus, active. These are sort of built in that the style, the layout engine kind of looks for. So we'll take a look quickly at what this does. So if I have a class over here, menu button, and I want to make sure that I have some sort of visual feedback for when I'm hovering over this element. So I can create a new selector by zooming in here and clicking on Add New Selector. And it's important that if you're creating a class, that this begins with a period. This is by default. It will always begin with a period. So we're going to have the same name, menu button, and we have colon, hover. So simple as that. And I'm going to select this this class, and I'm going to think about what I want to do with it when I hover. I think for now let's just make it white. Just make it a bit brighter. I think I might scale it up, perhaps. And maybe that's about it. Now, you'll notice I didn't actually do anything. I didn't have to assign this, mainly because it looks for the class selector, and this sort of magically happens. So I hit preview, and I mouse over this. You'll see that my button grows up. But nothing happens when I click it, because I don't have a pseudo class for that yet. But it's pretty cool, just with just adding this little class and a bit of styling, you already have functional sort of menu hover. So we're going to do the same thing. Add new selector. You're going to call it menu button, and this one will be active. and this sort of relates to interacting with the element. So in this case, I would like to say translate it down so it looks like I'm pressing it, and setting it back to its original scale. Now this part's a little bit tricky because if you don't, if it's not been set, this will actually not scale back down when I click. So you want to make sure that it kind of actually sets. So if you just type in 1, it won't do anything, so you have to change the value first and then type 1 back in. So now the button sort of, when I hover over it, when I click, it pops back down. So that's kind of neat. It's also kind of boring because there's no transitions. Actually, maybe I'll change the color a bit to, I'll give it a blue tint or a green tint when I click on it. So you'll see it's pretty quick to change things, but it's a little boring. There's no animations. It just sort of pops in and out. So what we can do is it's actually really simple. Going to the base class where this is happening, you can set. If you scroll all the way down to transitions, you can actually set this. So by default, it's set to all, which means it'll basically change. It'll basically animate whatever changes, like when these pseudo classes happen. You can make it very specific, like you can have it only on opacity or position, scale, translation, and you can chain things together with delays. So you might have opacity and then add another transition and add, say, position, add one more, and say color, for example. But we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with all, and we're just going to do a fairly quick, snappy transition, 0.1. Keep the easing there. So keep everything at its defaults. So just setting that on the root, on the base class, we already have some animations. So when I click, it smoothly animates, and you can change the easings. So say ease out back, for example, for something a bit more snappy. And that's basically it. So right now we don't actually have any behavioral functionality. There's no way to set any data binding or even sort of event, like, click events and what happens with those. For that, we'll actually have to go into C#. Another thing we're going to do is add a little control to show what data binding might look like. So I've got just an empty container I'm going to call options container, and I'm going to put a slider. This slider. Change the label. Style it real quick. Consistent with the rest. And lastly, we're going to add another selector here. Call this. The reason being is what we're going to do is we're going to set up, in addition to the data binding, we're going to set up the options button so that it hides and shows this volume slider. So in hide, we're going to take a look at the display and visibility. So display and visibility, or the display section, has a couple of interesting things. The opacity is fairly straightforward. It will set the opacity for itself and all children. Visibility will basically hide the rendering, not render. Display, though, gets kind of interesting because display none will actually remove the entire element from the layout. And so everything else kind of shifts back to take its place. So that's what we're going to do with hide here. We're going to set the hide class to display none. And programmatically in C#, we're basically going to toggle that class on this, this object when options is clicked. Now, one last thing we're going to do before we go over to C# is to take a look at a pretty interesting feature, which is variables, USS variables. So right now it's kind of cool because you know, I can say set the color of my buttons on my class and the color of the hover and active. What would be interesting though is if I'm using that color as sort of an accent color throughout different elements, so not just buttons, perhaps labels. Perhaps I want the background of this to also be the text color of these labels. So that would be a little bit challenging. I mean, if I have a bunch of classes, that helps. But if I wanted to define a specific color, say an accent color, and have that be used globally, what I could do is, and this is unfortunately not currently doable inside UI Builder itself, but what we can do is we can define variables. So if I open up the USS, I can create a root selector here in my CSS, open that up, and I can create a variable here, and all variables for USS have to begin with a double hyphen. So let's just call this accent color, and this will just be a standard thing. So let's just call it 227 and 255. So it's kind of a lilac or something. So if I save this and pop back over here, nothing's changed. But what I can do is I can, instead of selecting a color, go to my class, instead of selecting a color from here, what I can do is I can right click and I can set a variable. And this lets me kind of pick either some, you know, predefined variables, and these come from the runtime theme that Unity ships with. I can also have my own variable here, which I defined, which is accent color. So that gets me this lilac. I can do the same with, say, I give this a label. I can do the same with the menu label. Perhaps I can change the text color to the variable. Now I have this. So that's kind of cool, because what I can then do is we can actually just change this. So it's basically like a set once, use everywhere. Save that. And everything else, everything's using, that's using that variable is now the same color. So that's kind of useful. So with that, let's jump back over to Chrome for a bit, to slides. Now, we talked a little bit about the alignment, flex, positioning, the display, whereby visibility hidden does not remove an object from the layout, while display none does. We talked about margins, border, padding. We talked a little bit about the transitions, which we use to create smooth animations for the hover and click states. We talked a little bit about classes, pseudoclasses, selectors. There's more documentation in the manual, but essentially your classes, which are your things like the dot menu button, dot menu label, pseudoclasses, which are the :hover, :active, and selectors are just ways to get at your to basically kind of walk through the document model and get at different specific elements. So classes are really useful for using collections of style properties, and you can combine them. You could have a menu class, and you can also have a button class, and you could use both of those. So you might be splitting up your styling collections so that you can kind of mix and match. We just talked a bit about variables, where you can do sort of a define once, use everywhere, and the scope is determined by the hierarchy. So wherever the variable is defined, all children can use it, which is why it's useful to have it in the root. So UI Builder can reference variables, but it can't define them. However, let's take a look here again. When you're using a variable, you get a somewhat subtle hint that it's a variable. There's a black background around the property name. But there's no way to actually create variables within UI Builder, or edit them for that matter. So UI document is basically sort of a way to display your runtime UI. So once you've created your UI, you've got something saved. Let's go ahead and move this out of the way. Now in your scene, if you go in here and you right click and go to UI Toolkit, you'll get a UI document. So if you create that, just leave the name. You get a UI document, and this comes with the panel settings and a source asset. The source asset is just the UXML file. So we're going to put that there. And once you drop that in, it immediately shows you what it looks like. Now, the panel settings sort of helps to determine kind of how that renders. You can actually set it to render to a target texture, render texture. So if you wanted to display this UI, in the world somewhere, you can do that. Wouldn't be able to interact with it, but you can display it. And then you can sort of get similar to the uGUI canvas, you can do pixels, constant pixel size, physical size, or scale with screen size. So these are fairly similar. And that will sort of determine how your UI displays. Now if I hit play now, I still get everything here. All right, I can do this. It doesn't do anything right now, this slider, but I get the transitions, I get the hover and click behaviors. So that was a fairly long session. We're going to take a quick break before we jump back into C# for a short session.
May want to address some of the common questions that may be useful for the whole audience that have already been.
Yep. Yeah, there's been a bunch of good questions. Keep those coming. There's been a couple of questions about the performance side of things for UI Toolkit versus say uGUI. So in general, UI Toolkit has been built so it's quite performant in terms of rendering, in terms of the sort of building of I guess the rebuilding of geometry when parts of the UI change, for example. So it's in general quite performant. It does pay to do some profiling just to make sure that UI Toolkit does make sense for what you need it to do. So that would be doing like stress tests like with list views and whatnot. A couple of the other questions kind of came around whether it's appropriate to use UI Toolkit. A lot of things like XR, VR, whether these things can work in world space. Currently, there's no real way to get this working in world space. You can display them in world space using the panel renderer, but there's no actual sort of interaction. So you won't be able to click buttons without either a lot of work or grabbing a third party, like a third party sort of repo. There's a couple of questions about animations. So right now, aside from transitions, there's no real animation capabilities yet. We are working on keyframed animations on the roadmap, and those will be coming sometime. I'm not sure the timeline, but keyframed animations will be coming. So that'll let you be a lot more flexible. Right now, it's primarily just the transitions, and those don't actually animate everything, just a subset of the properties that are available. Possible to create scrolling text or animated highlighting text? Yes. So scrolling text, I guess you can either use a list view. There's also the translate property, which is animatable. And highlighting of text, yes. Oh, sorry. I believe if you're talking about sort of highlighting text as if it's being read, that might not be doable, at least out of the box, at least not without a bit of work to actually modify the text input that's going in, maybe with like rich text tags. So in that case, it might be worth using uGUI and like TextMesh Pro, but I think you can do it with a bit of work. Let me see, animate UI. Custom pop-ups. I'm unsure about what that. Oh, I'm assuming that means that's sort of like editor GUI based. UI Toolkit actually it started off primarily with editor tools. So it was only recently that we kind of released it for runtime. So if you're talking about doing custom editor tools, editor windows, custom inspectors, UI Toolkit is great. I've used it quite a bit for my own tooling. So yeah, it's pretty good. It's also moving towards being the default for editor tools rather than IMGUI.
Awesome, thanks, Teck. We can continue on.
Cheers. All right, so now we're going to take a look at data binding and events. So as I mentioned earlier, there's no way to sort of build functionality from UI Builder, and so any functionality in terms of responding to events, in terms of data binding, will happen in C#. Now, queries are they're an almost crucial, essential way to look for elements in order to do your bindings of your data bindings. These queries are, so if you've done any jQuery or you've done link in C#, this would be very similar in how the syntax works, but it's very optimized. Like uQuery is very optimized for memory allocation. The syntax is pretty straightforward. It's just your element.q and a type, and you pass it a name. Optionally pass it a name. If you don't, it'll just grab the first thing. Using the full query, like element.query, will return a builder. So this was sort of like an IEnumerable that you get from like a link query. And so this is basically going to be fairly essential to get a hold of the elements that you need in order to do your data binding or registering for events. So data binding, UI Builder, like I said, only provides the tools for layout and style. Behavior is all in C#. There are some limitations. In terms of editor side scripting, it's pretty powerful. You can just do a two-way bind on any property, and it's just literally just a property.bind, and you pass it the property, or an element.bind, you pass it the property. That's editor only for now. For now, runtime binding is still manually done. Like you need to register for change events and set things up. Runtime proper binding is on the roadmap. So for the editor, it's pretty straightforward. You've got a binding path on your element, and you've got a bind and bind property methods. And those are super straightforward. You just pass them the property, and you're good to go. You've got a two-way bind all set up. Very painless. At runtime, you're basically going to be doing a callback register. So you're registering your callback and firing off a method. With events, you're responding to button clicks and mouse behavior. So things like your click events. So with that, we're going to take a look at what that looks like in Visual Studio. So I've got a script already pre-prepared. First thing you're going to want is to make sure you've got the right namespace imported, Unity-engine.ui elements. If you're working on editor, you're going to have using Unity-editor.ui elements, and that'll give you access to things like the color fields and property fields. We talked just now about the UI document component, so you're going to want a reference to that. And from there, it's actually relatively straightforward to get to things and kind of start setting up callbacks. So I have a reference to the root visual element, and basically most of the UI Toolkit stuff has a root visual element to get to. It's basically the root document or the root of the document. So from there, I'm getting a reference to the volume slider, and that's basically using that uQuery. So we've got a root, we do a uQuery, and of type slider int. And I know because that's what I need to get. It's my slider int that I added. And to be more specific, I make sure that I pass in the name volume slider, so that there's no chance of conflict of getting the wrong thing. Once I've got that volume slider, I can just register. So this is one of the built-in sort of helper callbacks. It's a register value changed callback, and this basically takes the parameter a change event of type, whatever the control is sort of operating on. So in this case, it's a change event of type int. So pass that along, and the change event has a few properties, but typically the more commonly used, or at least for me, like the more useful ones, are one is just new value, and that's basically what the value was changed to. You also get an old value or previous value. So if you need to do anything with the previous value. So right now I'm just doing something simple, which is just printing it to the console. And that's the register value. That's the value change notification. It's pretty straightforward. For the click events, again, fairly straightforward. I get my button reference, and then I just register to the clicked event. So the options button dot clicked, and then I sort of subscribe to it with an anonymous function, and I just do a toggle in class list. So let's jump back here for a second. We got our options container, and that's the one that contains my my volume slider. And all we're doing here, like after we get a reference to that, is I'm just adding that hide class to the container. So immediately it's going to hide because the class is now active. And anytime we click on the options button, it will toggle that class. So it will hide or show. And that's really actually all there is to it. So jumping back over to Unity, we can take a look at what that looks like. Without that menu component, I've got the clicks and the slider, but there's nothing actually hooked up, so there's nothing actually happening. Now, once I add that menu component and I make sure that it has that UI document reference, now you see that the slider immediately hides. So now if I click on options, I get the volume slider, and I can drag this around and I'll get my change notifications here. And this only fires off when I click on something or when the value changes. So it's not like you're kind of spamming the event all the time. It's all callback based. So yeah, and everything else still works. And so with that, one last bit about C# is that if you really wanted to, you could actually build your entire UI via C#. I've done that sometimes. If you're used to IMGUI, where you're building all of your editor tools out of code anyway, it can sometimes be fairly quick to build out your UI in C#. And it's just element.add, new element, you new up an element, you configure it, and then add it to the root or add it to another container. Fairly straightforward. But honestly, UI Builder is quite pleasant to use nowadays, generally speaking. And so with that, let's go to questions.
If anyone has any further questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. Also, don't forget to fill out our survey for today's webinar, which will appear in the chat box any minute. This is the final question round, correct, Teck?
Yeah, that's correct.
Excellent. So the survey form is now in the chat window. If you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to fill that out so that we can better adapt the content and topics you'd like us to be talking about. And please opt in for the swag pack at the end of that survey form if you'd like to be in today's lucky draw. And in the meantime, while we're looking at the rest of the Q&A, maybe someone from your team, Teck, can pick out today's best question and we can contact that person.
Yep, will do. In the meantime, so I'm going to flag up. I know a lot of people were asking about the black screen. Yeah, that was caught quite late, shortly before we went live, so I didn't have time to fix that. The recording, we'll fix that before we send the recording out. I have a question here that I want to actually look at. It was a pretty good question about whether you can insert multiple style classes on a single object. And yes, that's absolutely possible. So the class objects in, like, for example, when I made that menu button, you could, if you wanted if you wanted to break that into sort of smaller little classes that are potentially more reusable depending on your needs. So you might have, let's say, if I wanted to really break it down to something fairly extreme, I could have like a bold class, an italics class, and I'd be able to mix and match those. So I could I could add a bold class and an italic class to a single object, and it would take both of those properties. So that was a pretty good question. Let me see. All right. So I think for the oh, got two more questions coming in. Similar to CSS, can we use all CSS properties, especially animate? So it is a subset of CSS, so it's not like the full implementation. As far as animated properties, not everything is animatable. I'm not actually sure where to find the specifics of which properties are fully animatable. But there's three different categorizations for those. There's fully animatable, in which case the value will smoothly transition from start to end. There's, I forget the name of it, but there's one where at the beginning of a transition and the end of a transition, the value will just sort of pop over. So for example, like the display flex or display none. So at the end of the transition, it will just pop into display flex or none. And then there are properties that are not animatable. Those that are actually animatable, you'll see in the drop-down list in the transitions section when you try to add one. It doesn't tell you which ones will smoothly animate though. Let me see. Okay, so if you're doing multiple menu screens, do you create a UI document? Yes, I've seen that done. I believe that is the sort of established way to do it. I think I've also seen people use multiple panel renderers rather than UI documents. So that's also one way you can do it. And I think when you're disabling and enabling them, you also get the various like transition events if you have any. Do I need to learn C# first before I learn how to use? So you actually don't need to learn C# to use this. So UI Toolkit or UI Builder itself was really made to be a visual designer. So it's something where, because of the separation of functionality and sort of like your layout and styling, a pure designer, web designer, graphic designer can work on the visuals of let's say the UI, and a programmer can kind of work completely separately on sort of hooking up functionality to it. How would you approach building a dynamic table? That's gonna, if you're talking about sort of like a 2D, like sort of Excel kind of table, that is largely going to come down to a lot of just sort of data callbacks. So again, because there's no two-way data binding for runtime, you're basically going to be doing a lot of your own callbacks. So whether that's value change callbacks, your click callbacks, if you're sorting, you might have to do something. There is a list view, which provides a lot of sort of built-in callbacks for when you add and remove items, but that's a 1D sort of list. So for a table, you might use a combination, like maybe multiple lists, or you might just kind of build your own 2D your own 2D data representation for that and kind of handle that manually. There's a roadmap coming there. I mean, there is grid sort of layout functionality coming in the roadmap, but I'm not sure when that's going to come. Can we use it to move an object just like a car game? So I don't know if it would be the best use of UI Toolkit, but I could potentially see something like that working. I mean, you've got web pages using CSS or using almost pure CSS act that you can kind of interact with like a game. So that's possible. Use other languages other than C# in building a game. For Unity, it's largely going to be C# or our visual scripting. Aside from that, there's not much that's supported out of the box other than C#.
And just a note to Virendra, who asked that question on moving an object like in a car game. We recently did a building an arcade racer series over the last 6 weeks. So please check your email, or maybe Sarah can pop the link into the chat now where to find that series to rewatch it online. Thanks, Teck.
Sure. Let me see. Okay, so after creating the UI screens, UI Toolkit, each element can be modified in the inspector window. Yes, basically, for example, if you build out your UI purely via UXML, like if you hand write the XML, you can load that up in UI Builder, and you can modify that. You can inspect everything. You can assign style sheets. Curved UI is actually sort of doable. So when you're creating your UI document, that panel renderer or the panel settings asset that gets assigned, you can create a new one, and under the display, I think with the display option, it's the third or fourth option. There's a drop down. You can set it up to render to a render texture. In which case you can take that render texture and apply that to, say, a curved mesh. And I actually did a quick test with that yesterday, the day before. It works decently. You just got to remember the cost of rendering something to a render texture. The larger it is, the more memory it's going to take. I think that's it for the open questions.
There was just one question here which I answered in text, but would it be possible to have a future session which covers how to hook up the new input system with UI elements, ideally with the fleshed out example of a typical full set of menus for a game? We will definitely take that on board in terms of planning our content. Thank you for that suggestion. And Teck, do you have a best question of the day for our prize winner?
Yeah, I think we're going to go with Marvin Mendoza, who asked if you can insert multiple style classes in a single object, or whether that would cause like an overriding issue.
Great. I'm just looking for Marvin now. I'm dropping Marvin a quick direct text. Marvin, I've dropped you a message in the chat window directly. If you can just respond to me with your email address, and I will have the team pop that prize pack out for you. Just wait for you to respond there so I can snap that up. And thank you everybody for joining us recently on our few series that we've run, including the one I just mentioned, Building an Arcade Racer. We will be taking our webinars for the next couple of months will be a little less frequent. Every couple of weeks, look out on your email for invitations to those as usual in our social media channels. And Marvin, I do have your email address, so thank you very much for that. And thank you for joining us today. If you have any other further questions, please feel free to contact us via our social media channels or our email address, events_sapac@unity3d.com will be in one of your email invites. Have a great Friday and a good weekend ahead, everybody. Thank you very much.